Okay, our next speaker, I also suspect, might not need too much introduction to this audience. Professor Guy Claxton is somebody that really enables us to reflect on pedagogy, reflect on our core purpose, reflect on what is important to us. Guy Claxton has been a leading figure in us understanding how students learn, and more recently has taken his work to the next level in enabling us to understand how our teaching may enable us to, for our students to be the most effective learners. Following on with the conference theme of C's, co-construction, creativity, etc., one of the pieces of work that Guy has really focused on is how can we create curious, creative, collaborative learners. I know that Guy has posed a challenge this morning, and again I wanted to share a quote from one of this morning's workshops. Guy's reminded me why I love this profession and why it is so important to me. Guy's reminded me about my core purpose to focus on children's learning. I welcome to the stage Professor Guy Claxton.
Working, yeah. Pleasure to be here and a chance to listen to my old mate Dylan, who is always interesting and fresh and surprising. So thank you very much, Dylan, for that. I want to start from a similar place to Dylan, but head off in a slightly different direction. In 2009, the director of International at Edexcel, a man called Ross Hall, commissioned research that turned out for him to be a bit of a road to Damascus experience. The research involved focus groups of 3,500 people in over 70 countries around the world and focused on their sense, their view, their experienced view of the fitness of education as a preparation for employment. Edexcel, as you will know, is not known for being a soft-nosed, woolly, liberal kind of organization. But he was blown away by the strength and the unanimity of the voice that came back from that piece of research. I just quote one small piece from the report in which that research was written up. To thrive in the 21st century, it's not enough to leave schools with a clutch of exam certificates. Students need to have learnt how to be tenacious and resourceful, imaginative and logical, how to know what to do when they don't know what to do, how to cope with situations for which, as Dylan reminded us, they've not been specifically prepared, how to be collaborative and inquisitive. The report went on, there's a significant disconnection between education systems and the needs of the 21st century. People may or may not have the right clutch of certificates, but far too few of them have the attitudes that employers know are the more important foundations of that elusive world-class workforce. And I want to focus in my few minutes on the line of thought that Dylan opened up, which is how do we, all of us I think probably in this hall know and agree, but how do we really respond to that need for us to put at the center of our educational enterprise the cultivation of attitudes? Most countries, certainly many countries around the world, know this and understand that this is a crucial thing to be doing and are busy trying to create powerful and effective descriptions to articulate the nature of what it is that's missing at this level of education. Not the level of knowledge and skills and grades and attendance and good behavior, but of the systematic, gradual, demonstrable cultivation of certain kinds of attitudes. People are always fond of reminding each other that education is a moral business. There's no escaping from it. There's no hiding behind quasi-neutral words like standards or appropriate. We are making moral choices dozens of times a day about what is more worth knowing than what else, what way of using your mind is better or more valuable than what other way. So you can look at the new Irish Junior Cycle, which is the nice name that they give to approximately to Key Stage 3, and you'll find a set of very familiar terms: being flexible, imagining, exploring options, taking risks. You all know this vocabulary, and it's in use around the world, even in countries whose current educational preoccupations tend to get misrepresented by some ministers of education from other countries. In the Singapore of 10 years ago, there was indeed a concern to turn out, what was the statistic? Something like 93% of 2-year-olds in Singapore were able to multiply 3/4 by 4.3 and get the right answer. It wasn't exactly that, but something like that. Whereas now their concern is to produce what? Confident people, very familiar from the personal learning and thinking skills descriptions and from other descriptions around the planet. People who can think independently and critical, be self-directed, question, reflect, be active contributors to their cultures and their society, who can exercise initiative, who can cope well with uncertainty. The New Zealand national curriculum, published to much fanfare in 2007, again, used exactly the same vocabulary. There seems to be a real unanimity, unless countries are simply copying each other's forms of words, which may be partly true, but lots of people have sat in rooms and tried to nut out this, and they come out with a very core set of things. In New Zealand, to relate well to others, resourceful, responsible, enterprising, drawing on personal knowledge and intuition. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Do we teach kids when and how to make good use of their intuition in schools? Do we teach them how to ask good questions? Do we coach the development of their ability to challenge the basis of assumptions? All kinds of things that we might ask ourselves, so what's the implication of that for me? I was running a workshop a little while ago. In the break, I got talking to a group of secondary history teachers, and we started to talk about their disquiet about the extent to which their students seemed to be completely uncritical of what they read on the internet. They read something on Wikipedia and sort of believed that it was true because it was written down. They didn't bring a critical intelligence to questions of validity or how we would check or how do we evaluate or who's saying this with what possible overt or ulterior purpose and so on. And I said to them, I got to know them a little bit, so I thought I could get away with this. I said to them, so yeah, I agree with you, but just reassure me that the way you're teaching the courses of the First World War to your Year 9s is designed to produce, to develop systematically and strongly that skeptical attitude towards other people's knowledge claims that you're now complaining they don't have. And some of them went a bit quiet because they hadn't connected the dots yet. They hadn't seen that the causes of the First World War or the Tudors were exercise machines, potentially, for developing the attitudes towards knowledge, which they, like the rest of us, completely acknowledge are really powerful and useful life skills. And it's that level of thinking which I think we need to get to. What difference does it make to the way I do simultaneous equations or acids and bases or as you like it, or the difference between igneous and metamorphic rocks, or the origins of religious festivals, or whatever? How can I use those in the service of the cultivation of this set of attitudes which most people agree are of value? Even much vaunted Finland. I had an email this week from someone who I shouldn't name because this is not an official communication, but who's a fairly senior politician in policy advisor in the Finland education system. The Finnish system, despite the international success, needs to change. The engineering skills and mindset that built but also let down Nokia are not the recipe for future success. It's like Dylan's post hoc ergo propter hoc. We can't just leap on the back of someone else's model and ride off with it. The concerns from Finland, much vaunted Finland, are the same as they are in Singapore and in South Korea, which is something to do with this essential missing heart of what's going on in our maths lessons and our French lessons and our art lessons, which is how do we articulate, how do we be more deliberate, how can we become more forensic, how can we evidence more effectively our success at cultivating these dispositions. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges. So this thinking, obviously, you're all familiar with this. This is not the interest, the concern, the sympathy for these kinds of approaches is almost universal. There are only a very small number of people, some of them unfortunately have become ministers of education, who seem not to get it. But the vast majority of us, I think, are very mindful of the fact that this is at the heart of what we should be doing. And the language, the proliferation of language in this area is testament to the fact that people are groping to try and find ways of getting a handle on this. It's difficult. It's harder to grasp this idea that we are gradually, cumulatively cultivating mindsets and identities. If you want to put it in a fancy way, cultivating youngsters' epistemic identities, the way they relate to uncertainty, to trickiness, to challenge, to ambiguity, is being influenced moment by moment in those classrooms that Dylan was talking about. And obviously, the only question worth asking is how do we do this and at the same time continue to pay the right amount of attention to the development of the necessary literacies, numerical, verbal, digital, aesthetic literacies that we know kids need as well, and also trying to help them get the best test scores that we want. Those are that seems to me like this is the key question with which we are struggling, and it is difficult. And the difficulty is evidenced by the fact that many of these initiatives around the world they get a wave of enthusiasm, they spring up either in a national curriculum or in independent sectors or wherever, and then somehow or other that momentum all too often seems to die out. If you look at the salutary story of Tasmania that produced a wonderful description, world-leading description in its level of detail, in the fine-grainedness of the kinds of skills and attitudes and identities that we wanted our young Tasmanians to have, the Tasmanian essential learnings. And there was no doubt that there was a significant amount of sympathy, and yet when these proposals were published, there was a very short period of almost 6 weeks or at the most 2 months where the initiative collapsed, where important opinion formers in the media and politicians took against it because they didn't understand it, they didn't like the language, they didn't see what was being required, and they thought it would put in jeopardy other things that they did value as well. So it's difficult. We need to find ways of slipping between these problems, these potential pitfalls, and really try and find ways of taking these approaches ever more deeply to getting them into the bone marrow of the cultures of our schools, so that when you walk into schools, as many represented in this room, you can smell, you can taste, often within seconds, let alone minutes, that this is a place of non-defensiveness, of openness, of collegiality, of collaboration, of experimentation, of imagination, of tolerance of risk, of excitement about adventure. And you can walk into other schools where equally quickly you can get a feel that these qualities are missing. So it's the hard yards. It's like this is the deliberate practice for us that Dylan was talking about. The hard yards are to stick with this desire, this vision, when we find that the fine words and the fond hopes the bolt-ons, the Year 7 Learning to Learn course that we proudly made a fortnight for, the relegating these kinds of things to the world of team sports and drama, to the co-curriculum, rather than trying to find ways of driving them into the core of the curriculum itself. When we find that those are not as easy as we thought, what do we do next? Well, getting some idea of what gets in the way would be useful. What are some of the barriers, some of the hurdles at which we might fall? One of them is a tendency, and it's still in me, and I see it in some other people, to try and to turn the discourse in this area into a kind of binary opposition. It's like, so if you want us to think about process, then that must mean that you're no longer interested in content. If you want me to talk about learning skills, that must mean that somehow or other Shakespeare and algebra are no longer safe in your hands, that these are in competition with each other. To talk of skills is to take your eye off the standards ball. If we want to be more relevant, what happened to the rigor? Are we not getting into some fluffy territory? Traditional, progressive, academic and vocational we could load in there. So as I said before, the only question worth asking is to stick with the and, is not to kind of allow ourselves to stick that or in to this discourse, but to make sure that we're constantly trying to look for things which are and. But the temptation is all too great, isn't it? To slide away from the sustained difficulty of thinking about how to do this into the all too familiar Punch and Judy show, to pop it into the too hard basket and say, well, all right then, the best we can do is tinker with a 19th century model rather than do the difficult thing of trying to join the quest, to put it romantically, for the holy grail of and. And one of the reasons why I've put a bit of thought into this and done some reading, one of the reasons why so many of these initiatives, Tasmanian Initiative, our own personal learning and thinking skills, the key competencies curriculum in New Zealand, why with a change of political wind, these initiatives, which started with so much sympathy and understanding, seem to be so easily neglected or brushed aside. So that in New Zealand now and in our own country, a concern with these things becomes a kind of an option for people who are kind of fanatical about it, rather than something that sits and lives at the core of our educational discourse. And somehow or other, we need to understand what these barriers are and blockers are so that we can begin to get beyond the creating models and versions of these approaches which are flimsy, which are vulnerable to the arrival of politicians with a different hue. Politicians are, I mean, it's not their fault. The system requires them to be systematically averse to difficulty. To averse to difficulty, to complexity, and to things that take long periods of time to bear fruit, as Dylan was saying about the development of value added and the length of time that these things take. So understanding the barriers in our own minds and in colleagues' minds, the either-or thinking that I've just talked about, the antiquated view of children's ability as being fixed, which leads us to have a reflex pessimism about the extent to which these intelligent attitudes themselves that we're talking about can be formed. If you think that the most important thing to know about a young person's mind is the fixed size of the intelligent bucket that they were given when they were born, then that will stop you going looking for the expandable, stretchable, coachable musculature of their intelligence. It will stop you looking for it if you think the most important thing to know about a child is what their IQ is or whether they're bright, average, or struggling. A bolt-on or quick-fix attitude, of course, will make us intolerant of the time and the difficulty and the work that these kinds of things are going to take. The temptation to dress these things up in a language that often seems almost designed to alienate the very people whose sympathy is required if we're going to make progress with developing these things. Teachers, children, and their parents. It's no use trying to write these documents, as you will have seen them as I have, in many countries, which seem to be put together by people whose central purpose in life is to show off what they learned when they were doing their master's or their PhD in terms of complex polysyllabic language. We need to find language which is not dumbed down, that's quite the wrong metaphor, but which is vivid and attractive and appealing so that there is a groundswell of opinion which encourages us to take these kinds of things seriously. There has been, and again this links to what Dylan was saying, a systematic misunderstanding of the kind of learning that is being asked of teachers. It's not the kind of learning that you can get on a day's course or a 3-day course, or certainly not from reading a book. Habit change is even more difficult than habit formation. It's a process. It requires effort. It requires support. It requires self-forgiveness. It requires patience. It requires reminding yourself that there was a moment when you might have gone the new way, but you forgot and you went the old way. It's a process that is quite psychologically protracted and sophisticated, and we do no service to this agenda if we try and finesse the kind of professional development that is required of teachers. And then there are obviously some more familiar blockers, a general sort of lack of courage or energy or imagination, maybe born of some of these other weevils that get into some of our minds and kind of create an attitude of limitation or fixedness. And of course that the dead hand of that cynicism that masquerades as maturity in some schools. The idea that, you know, we have all seen keen, enthusiastic young teachers squashed by someone's apparent kindly advice that you can forget all that fancy stuff that you learned in college now, and this is the real world, and this is what's required, and you know, it didn't work back in the 70s, and believe me, it's not going to work now. If you think that the kinds of agendas that lie behind opening minds or habits of mind or building learning power or philosophy for children, if you think that those agendas are simply some kind of warmed up, rehashed version of a laissez-faire, child-centered, liberal, I'm deliberately using those pejorative words, approach to education, you haven't listened very hard to what people are saying these days, to the precision and degree of evidencedness that lies behind these new approaches. What we're talking about here is not a matter of a child-centered philosophy or ideology. It's a hard-nosed look at the demands of the future, just as Dylan was saying, and the attempt to do the difficult thing of designing a curriculum that is equal to the challenges that we can anticipate our young people will face. And that's an honorable task. In some schools, like this school that I've worked with, Bushfield Primary School, there's the chair of governors and the head teacher. There's a very clear, and in many schools represented in this room, there is a very clear gut involvement. You don't really get off first base with this agenda unless it's got under your skin, unless you personally have the feeling that it's our job not just, note the vital importance of the word just here, not just to help children master literacy and numeracy. This is a school that keeps its eye very tightly and clearly on the standards ball, but it draws its frame of success now more widely than their SAT scores and the performance of the first 11 and the reviews of the school play or the school production. Their frame of success now in all their thinking includes the cultivation of the dispositions that they hold dear. Which dispositions? We're failing, says Dr. Shum, the chair of governors, if we don't prepare them with the skills they need, and here come our familiar litany, our friends again, to cope with uncertainty, to cope with differing perspectives. with working with different kinds of people to ask good questions. You can feel the passionate commitment that gets you to the point where you will do the hard thinking, where you will do that deliberate practice, which is not easy, which requires discussion and argument amongst colleagues. So what's building learning power? What's BLP? The particular version of this that I've been associated with. Well, what it isn't is a package or a product or an answer that you can buy and float into a school and adopt as a way of avoiding the process of doing the hard work that I've been talking about. It's a philosophy, it's a vision, as many of these brother and sister initiatives around the planet are. It puts at the center the preparation for life in a complex world, not just, remember the just, not just for getting kids into good universities, or even beyond that honorable ambition of getting poor kids to college. It's more than that, and it's deeper than that. Of course, the literacies, and of course, getting the best grades you can for as many kids you can, in the clear and certain knowledge that grades are a competitive game, and that my daughter's 4 A's at A-level only have currency because your son didn't get them. That's like, with that knowledge in mind, we have to be up for asking ourselves, how can our kids leave school at 16 or 18 or 19, having got a very poor clutch of grades, but still able to look us in the eye and say with truth and gratitude, thank you for a damn good education, even though they were not winners on the grades game. And if we don't have good answers to that question, what else is at stake in school? How else do kids feel that they have spent, that those 11 or 12 years have been time well spent getting ready to know what to do when they don't know what to do? Being able to face being asked a tricky question by an Oxbridge admissions tutor, which is different from what you've been prepared for at school, and not being thrown and being able to think on your feet, which is precisely why they asked you a tricky question, and not to be discombobulated by that. That would seem to be a big part of what we're up to. An evidence base, and many of these approaches, habits of mind is one of the closest to my own way of approaching these things, which is developing a really good evidence base in the basic sciences, the learning sciences, the science of what David Perkins calls learnable intelligence, focusing on intelligence as a composite of learnable dispositions. Lauren Resnick, if asked now, will tell you she's one of the most famous and eminent intelligence researchers on the planet. In a recent publication, she said, intelligence is the sum total of your habits of mind. Habits are things that are acquired and things which can be changed. So we are legitimated by the science to go looking for, to become interested in, much more interested in, the malleability of youngsters' minds, and therefore the opportunity that we have to help them coach and develop those qualities of mind. Obviously, we need to be developing seeds and frameworks, tools that will help youngsters develop these qualities of mind, and illustrations that will help teachers develop, and route maps for knowing how to make progress. And we need to be evidencing, I think individual schools, as well as larger organizations, need to be trying to think creatively, as I and my colleagues have been trying our best to, about how we evidence progress. Clearly, we need to be listening to what the students are saying. Are they feeling, are they responding well to these kinds of shifts in the way we're organizing and managing and articulating what we're doing in our schools? Little Denisha, who responded in one of the schools in our research sample, said, I think she summed it up very well. She said, when she was asked to say what building learning power was like for her in her school, she said, well, if something's hard, you don't want to say, oh, this is hard, I'll just skip it. You try, because when you grow up, you might come to some answer you'll still not know, and you can't skip it then. And that's it in a nutshell, isn't it? That's the knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. Tom, who's 15, was 15 when this data was collected, is a bit older now, has just moved to a new school. He said, in my old school, they just gave you harder and harder worksheets. That was their conception of growth, of development, of progress. All about content. But here, this is interesting, they really stretch you to learn in different ways. In different ways. Now, many schools a while ago wouldn't have known what that meant, stretching youngsters' ability to learn in different ways. But now we have a better vocabulary. We have a better coaching conceptualization for what it is that we are able to address with young people. Now, Tom says, in this school you get lots of encouragement, so you learn to keep going and dig deep. Dig deep is a key concept in this school when things get difficult. Now I always like to see if I can take things one step further. In the space of 3 or 4 years, this high-achieving grammar school in the home counties has shifted from a very high-achieving school that was producing passive, instrumental, and compliant young men to a school that is now getting even better results and producing young men who are resilient, inquisitive, imaginative, and resourceful. So it's perfectly possible to do these things. If you look at just the way in which GCSE scores change, this is a very simple graph. We can analyze this data in more complex ways, just over different time spans from the year in which some of our schools started embarking on BLP to the latest year for which we have data. You find that your worries that this is going to be an either-or thing seem not to be justified. Youngsters who've been helped to become more resilient and resourceful take those attitudes into the examination room with them and do better on the tests. If you check out the Ofsted reports of schools that have done their best, and I'm just quoting from a couple here, they don't have to be outstanding schools and they don't have to be in London. If you follow up on the Ofsted reports, by and large, and this was before the last 2 years, by and large, when inspectors call on schools that have been genuinely putting their effort and their creativity behind these kinds of approaches, it doesn't feature on their checklists, but they love it when they see it. Students' enthusiasm for learning. They work cooperatively with each other well. The program develops students' understanding of how to learn and skills for lifelong learning. So it's something that we can do. What came out of our research, I've summarized in the workshop this morning, was summarized for me in 3 words. It's vital, it's difficult, and it's possible. And many of these schools are showing that. There is a great wealth over the last 10 years, a wealth of practical information that is out there now about how to address this complex question. How can we systematically, demonstrably, effectively build these habits and attitudes of mind in young people at the same time as we're also helping them get the best test scores they can. There's the work of, many of you will be very familiar with this work. There's John Hattie's translation of visible learning into very powerful and practical advice for teachers. There's the Harvard work of David Perkins and Ron Richart and others on the visible thinking program. There's Carol Dweck's work on mindset, Art Costa's work on building habits of mind, and some of our own work, all of which is accumulating around the world and in this room in a growing number of schools who, despite the pressures that Sue spoke about earlier on, have their tails up because they know that this is something that is absolutely vital to be paying attention to and something at which we can all make progress. There are many organizations, including the Expansive Education Network, which Bill Lucas and myself have been involved in developing, many others as well, others, Tapestry in Scotland that Dylan is working with, the Learning-Centered Schools movement of Chris Watkins and others, many examples of schools also around the planet, and I've just listed just a few of the schools that have found value in the building learning power approach in many different cultures. There is grounds for optimism. I think we now know that there is another way. We don't have to choose between a 21st century education which is risky of results and the feeling that somehow or other, when people start talking about EBACs and back to basics and forcing up, driving up, that wonderful expression that Ken Baker used to do, levering up standards, as if kids were like a car with a puncture that had to have their tires changed, that when those kinds of pressures are around us, we do not have to. That does not mean we must retreat into more of a 19th century model of teaching and learning, the teaching to the test that Sue talked about in her opening remarks. So I think there are grounds for cautious optimism and for a salutary and kind of long-term approach. It's no longer, oh, we can sort the kids into visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners, we can teach them how to do a mind map, we can get them sucking on bottles of water, and we'll have dealt with learning to learn. We now know that that journey is deeper and more difficult than that, but it's possible. And the evidence from my schools and from loads of schools around the planet is that if we have the wit and the imagination, we can, in many cases in this room, not begin it, but persist it with the enthusiasm and with the confidence that not only will we be helping kids do better on the tests, but we'll also be helping to prepare them for the tests of life. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Can if you like.
That's brilliant.